الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. Alhamdulillah, we're today back for another interesting podcast. The topic of today will be about a particular scholar, namely Taqi Ibn Taymiyyah. And we have today with us Shaykh Abu Ja'far Al-Hanbali. Welcome and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, Shaykh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So with this podcast, we want to talk about the Shaykh, who he is, and to make everything clear by addressing some issues surrounding him. So to begin, I'd like to ask you with the very first question, which is, who is Taqi Ibn Taymiyyah? Where was he from? What is his background? If you could take us through his life.
Okay. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Okay, to put the pieces together on the Imam, we kind of have to go through the background of, we have to talk about his grandfather and his father because of the family that he comes from. Imam Taqi ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah he was born in a city called Harran in today's Syria. Nabiyyuna Ibrahim alayhi salam is called the Sahib al-Hijratain, the prophet 4,000 years ago. Plus, he made hijrah from Kush in Iraq to Harran and then to al-Ard al-Muqaddasa in Palestine. So he's one of the Sahib al-Hijratain, and he is actually the first one to have made hijrah. The first of the Anbiya to have made hijrah alayhi salam, and Nabiyyuna Lut alayhi salam, his nephew, wound up making hijrah with him. So the first place he made hijrah from when he left Iraq was Harran. He made hijrah to Harran. And this place has produced some of the most dynamic scholars we have ever seen. So when you see someone with al-Harrani at the end of his name, know that he's from the city of Harran. Harran has just been, for 4,000 years, it's consistently come up on cuneiform tablets, trade routes with the ancient Egyptians, as well as trade routes with the Arabs. It's had this long history. So it's always been involved in something, that city. Now, the Banu Taymiyyah as a family, the first detailed historical account comes from the grandfather of the Imam Taqi ibn Taymiyyah. The grandfather is Abdul Salam ibn Abdullah ibn Abil Qasim ibn Abdullah al-Khidr ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Taymiyyah, also known as Majduddin. Now, Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he was born in the year 590 and died 652. Some accounts say 653. He studied there in Harran and also would set out and go to Baghdad in Iraq and study with the premier scholars there, one of the most important of which was Ibn al-Manni. And Ibn al-Manni, Abu Futyan, he was a towering figure, and he was said to have combined all the knowledge of the madhahib in one person. He never married. He combined all this knowledge together. This particular Imam Ibn al-Manni, he is the teacher of a teacher of Imam Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, while he is the teacher directly of Imam Muwafiq ibn Qudama. Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah was also contemporary to Shamsuddin Abdul Rahman ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi rahimahullah, who died 682, but they never met. They were contemporary. They went on Hajj at the same time in two different Hajj groups, but they never met, as far as we know from historical accounts. So these are two people, two major figures holding the same time period. They're contemporaneous to each other, and they're both these massive figures. So Abd salam or Majd ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, known in the Kutub as al-Majd, he produced the following seminal works. One is called al-Muharrar fil fiqh, the exceptional or clarifier in fiqh, which was the gathering together and collation of all the other fiqh rulings before him into a summarized, streamlined, systemized pattern. And the next seminal work would be his Al-Muntaqa fi Akhbar al-Mustafa, which is a book of ahkam. And within that, he laid the groundwork of what we would later discuss of takhrij al-hadith. Like when people say, Rawahu Bukhari or Muslim, and use these expressions, he was the first one to sort of popularize these in a systematic fashion. Also with the breaking down and calling things, oh, this is the sihah, or this is all collected by the sihah, or this is collected by the 5 or the 4. Like he created these complex coding systems to where what would happen is he would narrate a hadith and just put like ha, mim, ha. And that meant, okay, this is Imam Ahmad's Musnad and Ibn Majah, right? To save space and to make it easier for students to memorize larger amounts by creating what's known as these rumuz, these codes, right? So he's kind of the first one that introduced this, right? Others had been there, but they hadn't streamlined it. And so when you look at him, now where did he streamline it from? Well, he streamlined it from Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi. First cousin Imam Wafid ibn Qudama rahimahullah. He streamlined it from him because he'd been doing a lot of books on takhrij al-hadith. And he wrote his book Al-Kamal. Now Al-Kamal, as a side note, this is related though. Al-Kamal is the biographies of all of the narrators in the 6 books, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, and Nasa'i. He gathered all that together, all those narrators, and gave the full name, if possible, death, birth date, and something about how many ahadith they narrated and major events they were involved in.
MashaAllah.
Right. So Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he's pulling from that big tradition. Now, when he dies, the madhahib gathers his books together, and his Muharrar, as well as the books of Muwaffiq ibn Qudama, are the standardized sources for the madhahib. So they become the standard, right? And that is the way that it was.
Meaning the mu'tamad books.
Yes, they become the mu'tamad books, and all other books get built on top of that.
Oh,
right. Even all the way down to the eras that we're in, the books that are built on top of are those. So al-Buhuti and al-Karmi are building on top of the Muqni' and the Kafi and so on and so forth. Now, Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah is taking from another Ibn Taymiyyah before his time, which is his uncle, because the Bani Taymiyyah come from a family of theologians and preachers. So in this case, the other one he's taking from, some of the first people he took from is a Muhammad ibn al-Khidr ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Abdullah ibn Taymiyyah Al-Harrani, also known as Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah. Now, Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah, he dies 622 Hijri. Well, he's born 542. He dies 622. Now, what he does is he's one of the premier scholars of his time, and he's the chief qadi for Harran, their khatib, their faqih, and he's just a major figure, and he's the teacher of Majduddin Taymiyyah. Now, what this particular imam does, he influences Majduddin to love knowledge, have a huge love for knowledge, to the degree that he actually sets up a fiqh curriculum. And the fiqh curriculum that Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah sets up is composed of 3 books, which is Talkhis al-Matlab fi Talkhis al-Madhhab, which is the biggest book. And then he writes after that Targhib al-Qasid fi Taqrib al-Maqasid, which is the intermediate one. And then the smallest is Bulghat al-Saghib wa Bulghat al-Raghib. These are Mu'tamid Kutub in the madhahib. He's quoted frequently, right? So he sets this up. He writes a sharh on the Hidayah by none other than the great alim, Abu al-Khattab Mahfuz ibn Ahmad al-Kalwadhani, who was the Sheikh of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahimahumullah. So he sets this up. So he's known as this huge, towering figure. Now he writes this fiqh curriculum as kind of a friendly competition with the kutub that Imam al-Ghazali had written, because he saw the fiqh curriculum that he'd written. He thought, oh, it'd be good if I did that for our fiqh. So he kind of did that as a friendly competition. And he also, that methodology kind of made Imam Wafiquddin al-Qudama, rahimahullah, who he's contemporaries with, compete with him and create a curriculum. But instead of 3 books, Imam Wafiquddin al-Qudama, rahimahullah, he made 4. But then he also wrote other kutub, like he wrote a sharh on the Hidayah, a mukhtasar on al-Khiraqi, as well as the sharh on it. And he wrote an ikhtisar on other kutub. So Mu'afiquddin al-Qudama went further than Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah went. They did have a conversation with each other through writing because of a dispute that they had on the Ahl al-Bid'ah, because Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah made statements that were quite general, to the degree that it seemed like he was condemning all Ahl al-Bid'ah to the fire. But upon their writing with each other, it could be seen that it wasn't that at all. He was just upholding the position that in general Ahl al-Bid'ah are kuffar, they're generally condemned, but it doesn't necessarily mean each and every and all any. So once they corresponded with each other, it could be found that that was not the case. Right? So it was a very beautiful exchange they had, which is mentioned in Tabaqat, Volume 4, between them. It's beautiful, their discussion, because it's knowledge based, right? It's knowledge based, because these are all maraji'. Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah is a maraji', Majd ibn Taymiyyah is maraji', Muwafiq ibn Qudama is a maraji', Shamsuddin ibn Qudama is maraji'. These are knowledge based discussions. Right? So we then step down from Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah to his nephew, Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah. Now we come to Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah's son, who is Shihabuddin Abdul Halim ibn Taymiyyah. Now he dies in 682. He was a major faqih, a major qadi, and a major khatib in Harran. He taught regularly. He was a very forceful teacher and preacher, and was one of the most balanced in hadith teaching in his time. So his expectations of his students was within reason, because some teachers were very harsh, expected students to do a large amount of hifz, while their fahm, they weren't necessarily ready. And sometimes they punished the students. But he expected a smaller amount of hifz, but better fahm. And so because of that, he produced really good results. Now, when he gets married, he starts having children. And the most famous standout of those children is Ahmad ibn Al-Halim Taymiyyah. And Ahmad is known by his laqab, Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, who lived from 661 to 728 Hijri. Now, this particular imam, as we mentioned, he comes from a family we've discussed, his uncle, his grandfather, his father. Then there's also his grandmother, who was her chair in hadith. Now, where the Taymiyyah name, this Banu Taymiyyah, where the Taymiyyah came from, some say it was a female ancestor. Some say it was a male individual. There's discussions at length that run for a couple of pages on who exactly first bore this. But the point in matter is Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah came from this type of family. He had other siblings. If memory serves me correct, he had, I believe, 3 or 4 brothers. The most famous or outstanding of his brothers was Abdullah, who was also locked up a lot of the time with him. So Taqi ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he is referred to by Ibn Rajab as well as Ibn Al-Qayyim, as well as Imam al-Dhahabi as al-Imam, al-Faqih, al-Mujtahid, al-Muhaddith, al-Hafiz, al-Mufassir, al-Usuli, al-Zahid, Taqiyuddin, Abu al-Abbas, Shaykh al-Islam, Alim al-A'lam, right? He's referred to by all of these titles. So these titles, he's referred to Abu al-Abbas. Now, he did not have children. He's one of the imams in history that did not have children. He did not get married. So he dedicated his life to the knowledge. He was born on the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal in the year 661 in Harran. When he was small, his father takes him along with his brothers to Damascus. And this happened because the Tatars were in the earth. Because we have to remember, he's born 661. The catastrophe, the great catastrophe in Baghdad is what? 656.
Yes.
So he's living in the aftermath of 2 million people killed inside of a week.
This is the fall of Baghdad.
Yes, this is the fall of this. So the Tigris is running red with blood for 6 months. Euphrates black with ink for 6 months. Now he's living in the years after this point. Grows up, listens to his father in hadith, as well as Ibn Abd al-Da'im, Ibn Abil Yusr. His father, Abd al-Halim, is a strong teacher, and he has a number of teachers. The Imam, when he was very young, around 10 years of age, he's completed the Quran, so now he's listening to hadith. And one of the people whose dars he sat in while in Damascus was none other than Imam Yahya an-Nawawi rahimahullah. He was there in his gathering because Imam Nawawi died 676. He's there at 10, right? Listening in. Right now, while listening to hadith from Imam Nawawi, as well as other teachers, he heard the Musnad. He listened to the Musnad and went through it 3 times. Right? He heard the Sihah, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, Nasa'i twice. He heard the Mu'jam of Imam al-Tabarani, the Kabir, the Saghir, and the Awsat twice. He'd been through those, right? He'd memorized some of the early mutun in usul fiqh, as well as in fiqh itself. First by being tutored by his father, and then Shamsuddin ibn Qudama. So he learns from him. And this is also the source of his Qadiriyah from entering into the tariqah. Right? This is the source of this. So he learns also, he recites to another big Imam Arabic. He recites some Arabic mutun to the great Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi, who died 716 Hijri. So he recites to Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi, who's aware of him, who knows him. Right? He recites Sibawayh, understands that. He studies Tafsir al-Quran. He studies inheritance. He studies math, algebra, conic functions, and calculus. Right? Then he decides to look into ul-kalam and philosophy on his own. Right?
This is at a young age?
This is at a young age.
Okay.
So he takes a look at it, but he doesn't yet pick it up. He just looks into it briefly and then returns to his fiqh studies.
Okay.
Right? Now, this was all happening when he was 19.
MashaAllah.
He's between 19 and 20. He's doing all this stuff. So he reaches 19, 20 years of age. He's doing all this.
Remarkable.
He first is allowed to start giving fatwa at 20. Because of his huge amount of learning, his prodigious hifz, and his great understanding, and that he had a love for teaching people. Now, in 682, when his father, Imam Shihab ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, dies, he was devastated. He was 21 years of age, and he was put in charge of teaching hadith in the Madrasa Sukriyah. And this was 683. Now, those that were there include the chief Qadi Bahauddin ibn al-Zakki, Tajuddin al-Fizari, Zainuddin ibn Murajjad, and others. So he's teaching a gathering of hadith, guiding the people, and the people had a great amount of love for him. Imam al-Zahabi rahimahullah says about this that the Sheikh Tajuddin al-Fizari had great yubalighu fi ta'zimihi Sheikh Taqi, that he had great amount of love for Taqi ibn Taymiyyah, like he had a huge amount of respect for him, right? And that he sat down and learned numerous ahadith. And so he would, as was the case for people that teach hadith, or in generally from the Hanabila, they teach from the mimbar. And out of respect for the hadith, they'll usually stand. Right? They'll either stand or they'll sit at the mimbar, like how the people sit when the mu'adhin's making the adhan before they stand up for the khutbah. That out of respect for the hadith and the Rasulullah, because they treat it that, because when they're reciting hadith, it's like he's present. So that's why they do that. It's the same thing that Imam Malik rahimahullah would do. If people came to his house and they asked him to narrate hadith, he would go and make ghusl. He'd put on his best clothing as if he was going for Jummah, wrap his amama, and burn some incense, and then he would narrate. Right? So this is the respect, right, and that is due.
This narrating, is it by giving commentary, or is it just merely reading the hadith over?
Well, what would happen is there's two methods that these type of scholars would give when narrating. The first is to narrate the hadith and then take questions and give commentary upon the questions. Or they would narrate the hadith standing or sitting as they were. And then when they finished narrating the portion they were going to discuss today, then they would sit down in the gathering under the mimbar or stand down and start talking about the hadith and everything else. Right. So this is the general methodology that they used. Right. So this was how brilliant these people were. And he would do tafsir. He did tafsir for about 2 to 3 years there, where he regularly went through the tafsir of the Quran. And he reached Surah Nuh, and there was an incident, which was in the year 690 of the Hijri. And this is while he was at the mimbar on Jum'ah. He said something about the Sifat. He mentioned something about the Sifat. We're not told exactly what. It just says, ذكر على الكرسي يوم الجمعة شيئا من الصفات, that he just said something about the Sifat. فقام بعض المخالفين. And then some of the people got up in disputation. We don't know exactly what happened. But some of those who were present got upset. They tried to keep him from continuing on and teaching, but they were unable. Right? They were unable. Then the chief Qadi at that time, Shihabuddin al-Khawi, who was of another madhahib, he said himself, Ana ala i'tiqad al-Shaykh Taqiyuddin. He said, I'm on the creed of Shaykh Taqiyuddin. Like that, like his creed is my creed, like what he said. And so some people rebuked him for that, but the matter carried on, and people knew that what happened is this, but we knew that he hadn't said anything. فَهُوَ لَا يَقُولُ إِلَّا الصَّحِيحَ, that he hadn't said anything except what was correct, but some people just didn't look at it. Right? So it's obvious that he didn't say anything that was out of the ordinary. So some of the people that were present there must have obviously had a philosophical bent or what have you. But this is the first recorded incident that we had where he kind of had a falling out with some people.
And if I may ask you, is this at the height of his teaching, or is he still reaching his height of being a scholar?
He's still building at this point, because you got to remember he's born 661. It's 690, right? Right. So he's still sort of gathering momentum, right? And so at this point in volume 4 of Talaq al-Hanabila, we're on page 322. So At this point, then, the Sheikh Sharafuddin al-Maqdisi, he said that he hoped for the barakah from Taqi ibn Taymiyyah and his dua. And he says, he's my companion, he's my brother. And the same thing was said about this by Barzali in his Tarikh, as well as other sheikhs that mention things. And he was held in high regard in spite of what the dispute was.
Sure.
Al-Dhahabi, mentioned in his comments on the history, refers to him as Ahmad ibn Al-Halim al-Harrani al-Dimashqi al-Hanbali Abu al-Abbas Taqiyuddin Shaykhuna wa Shaykh al-Islam wa Farid al-Asr aliman wa ma'rifa, right? So he says these words about him that, you know, he has all these titles, what madhahib he belongs to, his level, his knowledge of hadith, and so forth. And he has a really wide-ranging statement on him.
Before continuing, you just mentioned the word or the title Shaykh al-Islam. Just for the to make it clear, what is actually the meaning of a Shaykh al-Islam?
Normally, Shaykh al-Islam is reserved for people who are masters in all the fields and sciences, okay? And they would normally be a marja in this area. But we can see from literature, which we can discuss later about Taqi ibn Taymiyyah, that he was not a marja, but Shaykh al-Islam was used honorifically about him. So this was an honorific. Because sometimes in the Kutub, Imam Taqi ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he'll be called Bahr al-Ulum, the ocean of the sciences, or he'll be called Shaykh al-Islam, but it's more an honorific than actually the actual, because of how much knowledge that he spanned. But you'll notice that Dhahabi, who's from a different madhahib, Zamlakani, and others refer to him as Al-Hanbali, which is clearly establishing that he obviously belongs to a madhahib. No one ever understood that he didn't belong to a madhahib. No one ever understood that he was different to that. In fact, when we look in Majmu' Fatawa volumes 10, 11, 7, 9, 32, 26, and 20, in addition to other ones, he refers to Imam Ahmad as Imamuna. And this is madhab talk for the imam of his madhab. And the scholars of the madhab as ashabuna, our companions, right? He's obviously talking about his madhab. So in carrying on, we see that he had no issues carrying on until we reached the year, let's see. Okay, when he hit 22 years of age, the government came to him asking him to become chief qadi or to become sheikh of the sheikhs, which means under government post. He rejected the post. And this is something Ibn Rajab said, I read that in his actual handwriting. So he had a copy of the rejection letter that Taqi ibn Taymiyyah sent back. So he refused to go into the government and was actually quite hostile towards the government of his time, which would make sense because the Tatars at that point were influencing the government, if not through physical intimidation, they were influencing them in other ways, right? So everyone was worried about how great the government's influence would be. Right. We then come to another portion in the Imam's life. This portion was the year 708. And this is the year in which he made some statements regarding Talaq, and he proposed that if someone pronounces 3 talaqs in one sitting, that it counts as only 1 talaq. And this came from an area and ambiguity that he saw regarding pronouncing talaq upon a woman who's in her monthly cycle. Does that register as 3 talaqs at one, or is it one? Right, so it goes into this discussion about something that's haram for other than its reason, and something that's haram li dhatihi, something that's haram in and of itself. And Ibn Rajab brought that point out, as well as Ibn al-Mabrid, like to discuss in detail why this happened and his ijtihad on the topic. And he is alone in this particular issue.
And just for the listeners, would you just in brief tell us why this was an error?
Okay. The ijma that's been established by everyone is that someone pronouncing 3 talaq in one sitting equals an irrevocable talaq in which the woman goes into her iddah and cannot be reconciled to her husband unless she marries someone new. That marriage collapses, and then she is divorced and she's eligible to come back with the first husband. Part of why this is the case, not just the ijma, but the textual basis behind it, is because of the fact that there's a statement from Ibn Abbas and some say another companion, where it was said that in the time of the Rasul والسلام, and Abu Bakr, when people used to make 3 talaq in one sitting as ta'keed, because in Arabic you say things once or twice, sometimes 3 times, as what's called ta'keed. It's a way of emphasizing like the severity or greatness of something. Like in Surah Al-Fajr, وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. And so when your Lord shall come and the angels rows on rows on rows, right? Soffan, soffa, right? That's being done to emphasize, right? Just could have said soffan rows, but rows on rows, like it's a whole bunch, right? So people would say that in Arabic, people would use making talaq, they'd say, anti taliq, taliq, taliq. You were divorced, divorced, divorced. They'd say that as a means of ta'keed to emphasize the fact that I've pronounced it upon you, right? But because of the confusion that was coming in later ages with people coming into Islam, right? You reach the time of Omar. And in Omar's time, the parents were like, no, we no longer accept that as saying that that's ta'keed. We no longer accept that. You can no longer use that. They closed that door and said, you can no longer say it's ta'keed. From now on, if you say 3 talaqs in one sitting, no matter what, it means this. So they closed that door. Now, Taqi and Taymiyyah, using other discussions, particularly with regards to the woman on her monthly cycle, whether or not that counts as a talaq if she's on her cycle. He made ijtihad using that and leveraging other areas, and it led to that particular issue. Right.
And so, Sheikh, just to make it brief, so if somebody would make 3 talaqs in one sitting, meaning he cannot take her back unless she marries and divorces.
That's right.
But people can make this mistake that they only count these 3 as one, and they think after divorce they can remarry the woman again without her being married.
Yes, and this is not true. This is not true. So this happens, especially from people. It's like, well, yeah, but look at what was said, because this happens. Like, yeah, but those are for Arabs. That ta'keed is for like Arabic speakers. You're not an Arabic speaker.
Yes.
So how could you even use that as a proof? You're not even an Arabic speaker. So you're not in a circumstance where you could say, oh yeah, it's just one. It's like, no, that doesn't count as that, because not every language repeats things for ta'keed. Right? Arabic is known for repetition for ta'keed, right? Because it's driving home a point. But not every language makes repetition for ta'keed.
And unfortunately, a lot of people are acting upon this position.
Well, what they are not often considering is that they have to keep in mind that both Taqi and Taymiyyah and Ibn Al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, were punished by all the scholars of their time, of all the madhabs. Not just the Hanbalis, not just the Malikis, not just the Shafi'is, but all of them. Now, someone might say, well, that was only the people in their time. So was the truth submerged in their time? How could the truth be submerged in their time? there's no time where the truth was submerged from the earth. Or people might, then people inadvertently, this is a common mistake that happens in the English-speaking world. Well, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was the only one on the truth in Mecca or in Medina. Yes, but the people he came to were kuffar. Surely we're not suggesting that Imam Abu Hamza al-Maqdisi was kafir, are we? Or Zamlakani or Ibn Ata'Allah al-Askandari. We're not suggesting they were mushrikun, are we? So in order for an analogy to fit, there has to be a resemblance between the two things being compared, which in this case does not fit. But it's a constant issue that exists to the point where it's reached this time now. Whereas in a lot of parts of the Muslim world, this issue was never here until some people popularized some of the books, and then spread some of the thinking and the misappropriation of his particular rulings. But that's another discussion for another time.
Sure.
Now, as we go along through his life after this point, he also has an issue where he, around the time of 709, makes the statement that traveling out to visit the graves of the deceased or making intercession with them is haram. And he leans back on a rare ruling from Ibn Aqil, the big imam from 513 Hijri. He leans on that ruling that it's an annoyance to the dead, that you cannot visit them. Now, the curious thing about it is he leans on that ruling, but he doesn't lean on Ibn Aqil's ruling that for your salah to be sahih, it has to be prayed in jama'ah in the masjid. He doesn't lean on that ruling.
Interesting.
But for some reason, he takes the ruling about you can't visit the graves of the deceased to set out on a deceased. Because that ruling of Ibn Aqil is like 2 paragraphs under that other one. So it's very strange why that one was taken. So he's roundly condemned and spoken against, and he has a lot of other issues. But then around 709, he gets jailed for this issue because they 3 qadis had said this could be tantamount to lowering the rank of the prophets. They said, and this is kufr. So they asked him to explain his case. What did he mean when he said that making intercession with the deceased and these things is shirk? As well as minor shirk, if you depend upon them in the sense of omens and things like that. So he's released because he said, well, that's true technically. That, if you depended upon them for omens and things like that, that's like how some people depend on it. That's that, because that would mean that you saw a form of help or harm in them. So they released it. But he gets in trouble, though, again, for making a statement which was coming out of ul-Kalam, because now he delved back into it again. He made a statement coming out of ul-Kalam regarding the Sifat. And Taqi ibn Taymiyyah, his issue was because he saw so many people spiritualizing so many ayat in the Quran, what he did is he went on the higher side of ithbat, in which he made a really strong affirmation of the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the degree that in certain instances in the beginning of like Majmu' Fatawa, in the early volumes, he stated that someone can know the haqa'iq, the realities. It means the names, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent these ayat to us so that we might know them and act upon them, and Allah would not speak to us in a language that we didn't know, and so on and so forth. And so he said this, and this led him to be jailed. But when he was asked by the ruler of the area to explain himself, he produced al-Aqidat al-Wasitiyyah.
Okay.
And al-Aqidat al-Wasitiyyah as a metin, there's very little of Imam Taqi ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah's words in that text. It's primarily just affirming all these ayat. We affirm these ayat, we affirm this, we affirm that. So all the ayat about istiwa, all these ayat about the yadan and all these other things, just ithbat. There's nothing in there to fight with.
So the book is upon tafweed, if we
yeah, the book is just ithbat. It's just ithbat of sifat. It's not discussion of anything, just we believe in these ayat. So he'll cite 7 or 8 or 9 ayat.
All right, yes.
And there's just that, and then he'll say, and we believe in these, and he'll cite another. So he cites most of the sifat that there were issues with in the time, like nuzul, yadan, these type of things. So descent, the 2 sifa of hands, the sifa of ayn, right? He cites the sifa of istiwa. He cites all these, and he just gives you ayat. So he'll say this. The istiwa is mentioned 7 times in the Quran, and he just cites all 7 times. In the Sunnah, these things are referred to, and he just cites them, right? And it was an issue because some of the people in his time, the interpreting, especially in Syria and Damascus, was so serious that some people did not know that these types of ahadith, these types of sahih ahadith, existed in that form.
SubhanAllah. Because
people would cite the hadith and they would insert istila, or they would insert istawla into the hadith, so that many people did not know that word was not in the text. So when this was happening, when they're having meetings with him, because Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, who died 774, he's alive at this time because he was a student of Taqi ibn Taymiyyah for a period of time. He takes notes from this meeting, and some of the notes he also takes from Ibn Al-Qayyim. He takes notes from these to show that this is what was happening in these meetings. And he's asking them, why did you interpolate these words into the hadith which are not there? And some of the people that were there in the gathering said, well, it's done to keep the people from falling into tajseem and tashbih.
Right.
So we're helping them by doing this. But he said, but you're corrupting it because you're interpolating. Right? So, but no one can find any dispute with al-Aqidat al-Wasitiyyah because it's just filled with ayat, a hadith, and then he makes a statement about the abdal at the end, and who are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And there's not really anything that can be said, so he's released. He's released. Right. So what I'm seeing now today, people saying they have a problem with al-Aqidat al-Wasitiyyah, you'd have to be pretty much an imbecile, because that was not in any of the meetings. What they did take issue with was when he wrote the book al-Aqidat al-Hamawiyyah, the Kubra and the Sughra. That's when he really got in trouble, because that's when he went to the far end of ithbat, and he started using much more philosophical arguments. And it's in there that you could see the beginning of what would later become the Hayula, which was his teaching that all the creation, what we see and what we don't see, was in the essence of Allah. And this is untenable as theological position. It's untenable. But what was clear was that this was reached through ijtihad.